You're listening to the Loudoun Museum podcast. I'm Sarah Wolfley, and while I may not know all the ins and outs of public history, I'm on this journey with you to uncover the rich stories of our community. Together, we'll explore the fascinating history that's right in our backyard and hopefully spark a sense of pride in where we live. Let's dive into the past and discover what makes Loudoun County so special. Welcome to the Loudoun Museum's podcast and our very first episode. I'm Sarah Wolfley, a former intern and volunteer with the museum. Today, I'm so excited to talk to Tracy Gillespie, a previous volunteer, intern, and eventual executive director of the museum. Tracy has a wealth of knowledge to share about Loudoun, the museum, and the history of Hauntings, the longtime haunted history program the museum has led. I also want to acknowledge Anjali Diesman, our program and education manager, and Carrie Christofferson, the museum's director, who have been instrumental in helping piece together this podcast. Now, let's dive in. Tracy, could you start by telling us a little about yourself?
Sure. And first of all, thank you, Sarah, for inviting me to join you. I'm excited that we're getting the word out about the background of Hauntings, and because it's been around for so long. So, as you said, I've been in the museum and museum education field for a long time. I started my museum career at the Loudoun Museum back in 1984. And actually, it was before that because I volunteered a little bit there, like you obviously do. And I also did my internship there for my master's degree in museum education. So that morphed into a part-time museum education position, and then that became full-time. And that was for 10 years. I did museum education at the Loudoun Museum, school programming, public programming, hauntings, and other tours. And then in 1994, I became the executive director and stuck with that for 6 years. So I like to say I lived at the Loudoun Museum for at least 16 years. Mm-hmm. And from there, I went on to Morven Park and was the director of historical operations for 10 years there. And then my last stint was for about a dozen years with Nova Parks. There are a number of parks around the region, most of which are recreational, but a handful are historical. And I was managing historic sites down in the Aldi and Middleburg area, including the Aldi Mill. I retired in May of 2023, but I am still doing some part-time work as a history educator for Nova Parks, and then just volunteering and doing some fun things in our broader public education or public history field.
Amazing.
That's it in a nutshell. Been here all my life so far. I moved here to Loudoun when I was just under a year old, and so I grew up here and went away to college and graduate school, and then came back. My undergraduate was at West Hampton College at the University of Richmond. Okay. And then I went on to William & Mary to get my graduate degree in museum education.
Oh, nice. William & Mary's so beautiful.
Yeah.
And so you found your way back to Loudoun County, and is there kind of like something about Loudoun County that has kept you, I guess, like when it comes to the history, has kept you locked here rather than other places in Virginia?
Yeah, that's a good question. I think part of it is just having grown up here and having a lot of my family here. But what I've discovered over all these years with Loudoun's history is that we're a pretty good microcosm of American history in general. If there is a major story in our American history, you can pretty much find a local example here in Loudoun. We're in the midst right now of commemorating the 250th anniversary of the founding of America and of the Revolutionary War, and we have plenty of stories to tell about that. So just the fact that we can plug in Loudoun County just about anywhere We have a very, very interesting history, and I think the lay of the land to the beauty of the area that we've been able to preserve that that kind of combines with that story of history is wonderful.
I also grew up in Loudoun County, and from my point of view, being a host of this, I want to learn as much as I can about the history of Loudoun County because I was unaware of the history, even though I did walk downtown Leesburg and I did go to Morven Park or the battlefields or anyways, but it was this fascination I have. I hope that people can listen to this podcast and just understand more of the roots of Loudoun County.
I hope so too. I think a lot of Loudoun County residents don't do that, and I hope they will. I grew up in the eastern part of the county,
Mhm.
in the Sterling area, and it is not what it once was. So I work hard to try to keep what's still here of our history and our heritage. And a lot of our probably most of our residents don't know the history. And I know the museum, all the years I was there and the years since I left, um,
Mhm.
it strived to bring that history to our residents. And it's not easy, but I think it's a labor of love, isn't it, Sarah?
Having these stories and just understanding um, more of the lives, the people who are here before us, the events that happened, the buildings, and kind of the world before us in Loudoun County is just. It's definitely something that when you see the changes continue, it's very eerie to witness it um, and
A
to
good way
want.
to describe it.
We are going to jump right into these questions.
Okay.
Something that is so great about Leesburg is I knew, like growing up, my parents always had a ticket to go to the Hauntings. What inspired you to create the Hauntings?
Well, first let me say I didn't create it on my own, but
Mhm.
it was interesting. I think it was 1991, if memory serves me correctly. And it was actually the town of Leesburg that approached the museum. A member of their staff approached the museum about the idea of doing a ghost tour, doing something that would end up being called Leesburg Hauntings. And as I recall, the idea obviously for the town was to bring more people into the downtown area. For the museum, we were excited about it because we would be bringing more people into the museum, but also we'd be, literally and figuratively opening the door of the museum to people to learn more about our past, to learn more about our history. So it was that again the town, one or two staff members of the town, and then on the museum's part, myself, the director at the time, whose name was Laura Dutton, and Laura would go on to interpret at one of the sites for many, many years. And then a couple of instrumental members of the board of the Loudon Museum, Peter Kelpinski and Joe Holbert in particular. And really, the four of us, along with a couple of members of the town, sat down, figured out what we could do with this tour, and realized, well, first of all, we need to see if there's any stories. And fortunately, there were. And so that's what inspired it. I'm guessing here, Sarah, that this person with the town um, probably heard about something similar somewhere else in the country and said, "Hey, why don't we try something like that here?" So that's really what inspired it, and that's how the museum got involved. The town only was involved for the first couple of years, and then for a reason I don't remember, they said, "Okay, we're not going to do this anymore." But the museum was very, very keen to keep it going because it was successful. And so I'd say by 93, or at least by 1994, we had the sole ownership, so to speak, of the program and kept going with it from there.
When it came to thinking about the stories, because you said that you guys definitely had stories. Were these stories that were from that you kind of gathered from a particular source? Like, was it from people? Did you go and do research? Um,
Combination of that.
mhm,
Um, one of the board members I mentioned, Joe Holbert, was quite interested in the paranormal, if you will. So he was always asking people about, what stories do you have? And um, but we just literally started asking, and our neighbors, in downtown Leesburg were willing to share. And sometimes there were things that had been written down. Um, One gentleman who really was a key mover and shaker in Leesburg by the name of Frank Rafflo. He'd been the mayor at one point, and he was a key founder, along with his wife, with founding the museum back in the 1960s.
wow.
And Frank had written a small book about ghosts in the area. I am trying to remember now the name of it, but it should be on the bookshelf somewhere in Carrie's office. My husband's whispering to me, Loudoun Hauntings. And, really, as word got around, it maybe, I suppose the same thing still happens now in Leesburg, but back in the early 90s, we were small enough that word gets around, and we were fortunate enough at the museum that people would start coming to us with the stories. And the key thing we wanted is we did not want to make up stories.
Mhm.
We did not want the tour to be somebody jumping out of the bushes and saying boo. We wanted authentic, spooky, eerie, unusual stories,
Mhm.
and we needed them to be supported by and surrounded by history.
Mhm.
So again, we could, in that sort of unique way, um, force history down people's throats, while at the same time that we're telling them some ghost stories as well. So that was just a really crucial way that we wanted to start building those. And again, we were quite fortunate. And I can't remember now. By the time I left in 2000, we probably had used probably upwards of a dozen sites. Some sites every year, some maybe just once. And there were probably a handful that were key, sort of anchored the tour, if you will. And I'm sure there are ones that you would remember when you
Mhm.
came. Um, but again, yeah, we just wanted to make sure that they were authentic, and that we could, back them up with history, and then also dramatize them a little bit.
Yeah, that, when it comes to what I think of now as the hauntings, there are a range of locations that we get into groups and we are walking with a guider to the location. And then at the location, there's a storyteller, and they either tell the story, or they're kind of acting a little bit and wearing a costume of the era. And this is something that I didn't think about, is if it always looked like that.
It started pretty much the way it is now. And backing up a bit to, you were saying that you've gone to a couple in other places, and in preparation for this conversation with you, I was thinking that I think Leesburg Hauntings was one of the earlier ones,
Oh, wow.
certainly in the region, and maybe even broader. They're so popular now, but
Mhm.
back in the day, I think we were, among the first to do this. So yeah, we would start with the story at the site,
Mhm.
and then get as many details as we could, and then fill in the history around it, bring in what history we can. And I'll give you an example. One of the sites that was on the tour all the years that I was there is called the Glenfiddich House, which is on North King Street, um, historically known as Harrison Hall because it was owned by the Harrison family. And the ghost that is said to haunt it is of one Colonel Erasmus Burt of a Mississippi regiment that fought at the Battle of Ball's Bluff, just
Mm-hmm.
outside of Leesburg, on October 21st, 1861. We could tell the ghost stories there, the incidents that the owners experienced, but we could also, and certainly wanted to tell a little bit about him,
Mm-hmm.
about the battle, about his injury, and the fact that he was brought there um, using that house, like several houses were used, to recuperate, and that he died there.
Mm-hmm.
So there you go. We've got all those building blocks for the story, and then with the costuming or the period clothing, absolutely, we wanted to do that at all the sites because, again, as I'm sure you remember from the tours, it helps to bring the story more alive. Another crucial board member of the Lab Museum at the time who helped with that was a lady. Still, she's in Leesburg today. Her name is Meredith Bean McMath, and Meredith is a writer, theater director, and wonderful costume collection. And she and a couple of her friends helped to outfit us to start with, and we kind of just grew from there. We also were able to pull in some people who already had the appropriate clothing. Those folks involved with living history. So, for instance, if we had a Confederate soldier who we worked with, then he might be at Glenfiddich House because he would fit right in, and so that helped a lot too. And then in terms of how we told the stories, how we built them, in some instances they were acted out, as you were kind of alluding to, where first person, you know, I I was so and so living here at such time. In other instances, not in first person, but third person, but always again with the costuming. And we even and I don't I'm sorry to say I haven't been on a tour in a few years, but the tour group leaders, volunteers, along with all the others, we didn't at first, but after a few years we outfitted them, almost all gentlemen, from a couple of Knights of Columbus groups helped us out with this. They were the group tour leaders, and we outfitted them with capes and lanterns, and so they kind of fit the part also. And that just kind of tied it all together and brought it into that, you know, kind of eerie feeling, other time feeling that you would want.
Were there any challenges in the early days? And if there were any, how did you guys overcome them?
The biggest challenge, I'd say, and I'm sure that Carrie and Anjali can say it's still a challenge today, is getting the volunteers you need to help run the program.
Mm.
Um, and in its height, most of the years that I was doing this, we ran hauntings for 4 nights in a row, a Thursday, Friday, Saturday, Sunday, starting tours at 5 o'clock and running every 15 minutes through 9 o'clock. So we had, what, 17 groups, 4 nights in a row. And we had to have volunteers as group guides and volunteers as the storytellers and volunteers as for site supervisors. And then that left the staff, quote unquote, free to do things like sell the tickets if we saw them on site, which we were doing, and then checking on things. So really the biggest challenge was the number of volunteers that were needed. And I should go back and try to add them up, but you're talking dozens a night for 4 nights. Now we were very fortunate. We had a really committed group of volunteers with the museum, and a number of them would volunteer every night. It was absolutely amazing. A number of our board members would be site supervisors, so they might be at the courthouse site each of those 4 nights. And we reached out, like I said, the Knights of Columbus helped with the guiding. For most of the years that I was working, my husband was teaching AP history at Loudoun Valley High School, and he had a history club.
Mm-hmm.
And one of the sites always was given over to his students to interpret. So we would give them the information and we would outfit them. And then those 4 nights, we had students doing that. So it was a lot of coordinating and digging up those volunteers to begin with. And that's not easy. But yeah, that's definitely the biggest challenge.
You definitely need a strong team to get Hauntings to be what it is. And thankfully, I think due to the reputation of Leesburg's Hauntings and what you guys created and the process and what worked for you guys, it's just been a kind of what we've done every year where it's worked because of what you guys started and the bar you guys set for the expectations you had for the volunteers. So my next question is, who were the key individuals or groups involved in launching Hauntings?
The first year, the town approaching us, and
Mhm.
again, some of those couple of key board members, Peter and Joe, um, and they stayed with it all the way through the years that I was there. So that would have been from 91 until I left in 2000. And then after I left, they still were. In fact, I think Peter was still active until he moved out of the area, maybe 2 or 3 years ago. He was probably the most crucial hands-on person, which was amazing. And again, Meredith with the costuming. We had a couple of other board members who always were site supervisors, always there to help out. The site owners or the caretakers of the sites, especially those that year after year agree to allow us to be in the sites or on the property. Um, Judge Horn, who's now retired, but a key judge in the Loudoun County courts, and he allowed the courthouse to be open every year. I remember his assistant. That might not be what her title was, but Alice Alkire was her name, and she was just persistent about getting all the details we needed lined up for us. It's pretty amazing that a judge would allow a courtroom that's used, to be open and almost made into a theater set, if you will. So
Yeah.
they were Martha Lynch, who her home on North King Street, I think now the museum is calling that the Eliza story. And
Mhm.
Martha, again, opening her home to that. And then across the street at Glenfiddich, Melanie Miles always allowing us the use of that. Um, and again, I think, those volunteers that just came back year after year are the ones that there were probably a dozen of them, and they always wanted the same role. And they got really good at telling it, and they absorbed the character or the story really well. Having the high school students year after year, and those would be different, especially every couple of years as the students were graduating, and they just embraced the whole idea of here's another way to be able to interpret local history through the vehicle of a ghost story, and they always did really well with that. And what was fun with that was that we gave them the core of the story, but then they'd have to work on who was going to do what and how the flow was going to go. So that was kind of fun to watch young people do that. So yeah, I'd say some key individuals, some board members, site site owners.
But what kind of led you guys to set
this kind of, I don't want to say family friendly event, but it's not like walking through a cornfield and, people jumping out at you.
Because of the fact that it was a museum program.
Mm,
Um, we wanted to make sure again that it was history based, fact based where possible, And even though we're telling a ghost story, not everybody believes in ghosts,
mhm,
but we were, and I know the museum still is, taking a story that a person has experienced in this setting,
mhm,
and we're kind of dramatizing it, if you will. Um, so we're not making something up just to entertain um, the people on the tour. We certainly hope that they'll be entertained. That part of it, we want to be entertained. We want to be intrigued by it. And for that matter, we even wanted them to ask, "Gee, are ghosts real?" or "Do I believe in ghosts?" or so that was the whole idea behind it. Just to keep it based in what a museum should be doing.
mhm,
Um, Museums often have to walk the line with their mission as to what's appropriate to offer for a program and what isn't. And so, we had to be careful with that, as the museum still does. But the fact that the stories are all um, based upon and around historical happenings and people and the settings, I think helps that a lot.
It is interesting too to think about, I guess, how during the time you were there, how it evolved. Even though you stated that it's somewhat stayed the same, which it has because of the strong foundation you guys set. Was there a change in it in some ways, the time you were at the museum?
Well, I know each year, of course, the more stories would come in. I think we probably tried to add even more historical layers to the stories when we could.
Mm,
Um, we, I know we improved the historical costuming. We started out a little weak, but we tried. We would take modern day clothing and try to make it look a little old fashioned. And as time went on, we were again able to have some volunteers help us to make some items, borrow a little bit more that looked more the part, and sometimes bring in again some people who already had their costuming. So we got better with that. We also started to train our storytellers in the art of historical interpretation, of
mm,
telling um, a story of the past. And when we first started out, we had some guidelines, but after just a few years, it's like, okay, we need to have an evening session where we bring everyone together and share a few tidbits about what makes a good historical story, and what makes a good storyteller. Period.
mm.
We were very fortunate that we had some natural talent. And I'm sure the museum still does. I mean, I can think of a few people who were just absolutely amazing in this. You wonder why they weren't professionals of it. So I think training those who were new to it was something that we started to do as we went on, and then just the strategies for actually presenting the evening. We got better at it as we went along. Large groups of people back to back. Our groups were at least 25 people each and sometimes 30. And when you're sending them out every 15 minutes, and you're crossing a busy street,
Mm.
that can be a problem too. One of my favorite memories of Hauntings was one of the first years. I think it was the first time I dressed in period clothing. I actually decided to invest in renting a beautiful Civil War era hoop gown, and I was conducting people across the street, King Street, very busy, So stopping traffic, and one gentleman in his car rolled down his window and looking at me in this hoop skirt, and he says, "You look beautiful." And I was like, "Oh man, you've made my night." It's like I need to wear
Oh.
hoops time, but it was just so funny. And from that time on, I was like, if I need to stop traffic, just wear a hoop skirt because they're big enough. It's just gonna stop everything. So we
That
learned, as the years went on, we got a lot better with moving people around, making sure we had enough lanterns and flashlights and everything.
So, can you tell me about, I guess, pivotal moments or milestones that you remember when it comes to, I guess, the hauntings history?
I think overall milestone was that our little museum finally had a successful fundraising program. So not only was an educational program, but it made money for the museum. And in the earlier years, the years that I was there, our museum got very little funding from the county. You're talking well under 100,000 a year,
Mm.
and a skeletal staff. And the fact that we were actually making money as well as having fun on a tour,
Mhm.
and that we could do it year after year. That in itself was a milestone. A
Mhm.
favorite memory of mine, and I think a milestone, is we got some wonderful news coverage, and I'm sorry I don't remember which year it was. We were on Fox 5 Morning News,
Oh,
um,
wow.
and at that point, Tony Perkins, who was the weatherman on Fox 5, now he's a key news anchor with them.
Mhm.
He came out and he interviewed me and the gentleman I mentioned, two gentlemen, Peter Kelpinski and Joe Holbert. And we were all in period clothing and we stood in front of the log cabin, which then was a part of the museum.
Mhm.
And we were live early in the morning on television to talk about Leesburg Hauntings, and that was a first, for our little museum.
Yeah.
Um, I remember it was funny because we had communicated with Tony Perkins beforehand, and he comes out, and the first thing he says to me is, "I didn't think you'd be so young." I guess he had his image in his mind of a museum director being
Oh, yeah, the
a
stereotypical.
70-year-old gray-haired lady or something, and there I was like 32, 34, something like that. But that was really funny.
Funny.
But so that was definitely a highlight for us.
Mm.
Um, and then I think, another milestone was when it became a lot easier to get some sites, rather than us going looking for them. Occasionally a site or an owner of a site would come to us and say, "Hey, can we be a part of this?" That's neat too. So you need to have someone who's willing to say, "Yeah, we believe we have this ghost story and we're willing to share it with the public." And the other side of that is if they're allowing the site to be open, to the public. And sometimes not. Sometimes we'd have to be outside, and that's fine too. You're still
Yeah.
bringing them on the front porch or wherever. But that's a lot of trust in the museum, and that's special.
The confidence that the town had in it and that you guys had in it, and then especially if people continued having their houses open for the tours.
Yeah, and it's neat to see that now too, because I've noticed that there's a couple of business sponsors. The coffee shop that's created a
Mhm.
couple of drinks, and then the cocktails with sidebar. And it's just really neat because again, that's all right. It's a business saying, "Okay, we'll put our name on this and we'll partner with you on this." That shows again a lot of faith in the institution that the museum is.
How has the museum's mission influenced the program over the years?
The mission comes down to preserving, but just as importantly, sharing our local history
Mm.
with our community and with visitors. And um, this Leesburg Hauntings is a vehicle that the museum can use to share that history. It's unique, it's engaging, hopefully it's memorable. So I think it's definitely a good way for the museum to fulfill its mission because um, it is educating the people who come. Now, if you phrase it that way, if you ask a tour goer, what did you learn, or do you feel educated? They'll say, huh? But they are learning, so I think it's a good vehicle to do that.
Right. Yes, for sure. And do you have any, I guess, stories from participants that illustrates how the hauntings impacted them?
I can definitely say that it impacted our volunteers, and I know I've brought volunteers up a lot, but without the volunteers, the museum would not have existed at that time. And that's probably true now too. With, certainly hauntings wouldn't have happened, but really the museum probably couldn't have existed because we relied on them so much. And I think the impact on them was very positive. The fact that they wanted to come back each year, they wanted to be involved. They would even some of them would come to us with ideas for improving or changing up one of the stories or the tour in general. So definitely it impacted the participants who were presenting the program. Let's put it that way. I'm sure that people came up to me over the years with some story that I just don't remember. But I know, and I can definitely say people enjoyed it and gave us good feedback. We asked for commentary, and so that was good. We would occasionally, we being the leaders of the program, so myself ultimately, and then Peter Kelpinski, Joe Holbert, we would go out on the tour a few times each night to check on the storytellers, the site supervisors, the groups. And sometimes we would participate in one of the storytellers. So one year we had a 19th century funeral, a Civil War era funeral.
Oh, wow.
One of our volunteers built a period coffin.
Yeah,
that's probably still there.
it is, and I've always
Okay.
wondered if it was real or because I actually
it was built by a gentleman who lived there in Leesburg at the time and built according to the style of the time. And it was over on Cornwall Street. It was a site around the old stone church cemetery and the home next to it, which was a parsonage at the time. But anyway, one of our volunteers, board member, was the grieving widow of the soldier who had died during the war. And I remember distinctly Peter Kelpinski and I observing the tour, but also we're dressed in costuming of the time period. So let's just be among the mourners. And we did it actually a few times during this one evening. And every time we did it, Meredith had a different first name for her husband who she lost. And she had a deep well of knowledge of 19th century names. So she always came up with a good one. And Peter and I got to the point, we're supposed to be sad and everything. We were laughing so hard, we were crying. And we heard some people on the tour say, they are such good actors. Look at them. They're crying. Wow, we just can't believe this. And Peter and I are just cracking up and literally tears coming from our eyes. And we're just shaking, not with sorrow, but with humor, because Meredith was coming up with like the first name of a first husband in a row there. So there's a good impact there. People just noticing things like that.
One of the storytellers this year, she's a high schooler in theater, and I was talking to her about storytelling and why she's excited for to be a part of the hauntings and to be a storyteller, and she was just basically explaining to me her love for theater, and how she gets to, I guess, what step into that in the hauntings.
Yeah, if you do it several times a night,
Hmm.
and then if you do it more than one night, you have to be just as good every time.
What has been your personal journey with hauntings?
Yeah, I was asked not so much the first few years after I left. I think newer people came in and were like, okay, this is our baby, and we're going to do things now. I think it's become more comfortable now for people further removed from it to like Carrie to reach out and say, hey, can you tell me about this, or do you remember that? And I love that. I love the fact that we feel comfortable um, sharing information that way. Um, I will say that after I left the museum and, as I mentioned, went on to Morgan Park and then on to Nova Parks and particularly Aldi Mill, I took the idea with me. So at Morven, for a few years, we had ghost tours
Oh, wow.
um, inside and around the mansion there, and that was fun. That was challenging in itself because of it seemed like it was a larger area recovered. It probably wasn't, but it was just a little more complicated to get around, mostly because it's dark out there as opposed to being on sidewalks and on lit streets in town.
Yeah.
So that was challenging. And we didn't have the volunteer corps. We relied mostly on our staff, but that worked out too, and that was fun, and that was its own baby. And we did have some legitimate, if you will, stories out there. And then later, when I went on to Aldi Mill, a couple of years we did a program we called the Haunted Turnpike. The Turnpike being what is now Route 50 in front of the mill and running east to west through Middleburg and so on. And so I tried there, gathering stories, ghost stories that so we could do a similar program there. I was surprised that I couldn't find stories as easily as I did in Leesburg. I figured in an old little village like Aldi with lots of old, well, not lots, but a number of old structures that we'd have ghost stories coming to us, and that was harder than I thought. We did get a few good ones, and we did have a couple of years of good programs, not nearly the size of Hauntings, nor did we want that. But so that part of my journey was sort of taking Hauntings or the idea of Hauntings along with me, and that was fun. It's also been interesting again to see the idea of a ghost tour program slash fundraiser grow in popularity. So, seeing other sites try that.
Yeah.
And again, of course, seeing that it's still successful and still popular for the Loudoun Museum is good.
Yeah, for sure. Is there something that you are the most proud of, regarding hauntings history?
Well, I think what you and I both are saying is that it's still around.
Hmm.
That, what, uh, 24 years after I left the museum, Hauntings is still going strong. I think this would be what, like the 33rd year, something like that, and it's still around, and that is very gratifying. I'm proud of that. Again, it wasn't all because of me, certainly. I'm proud of it. I'm proud of it because of all of our team, our board and our volunteers and staff and everybody who made it happen. And lo and behold, it's still happening.
Seeing the posters of hauntings, and Carrie and Anjali have done such a really good job with branding and kind of
Yeah,
creating this symbol of what the hauntings are. I always get very excited when I see the posters come out again, and I'm like, oh, that's back. um
yeah, and it's neat. And I was mentioning about the sponsors. I am real excited that Carrie and Anjali have been able to get more businesses around the town to support it. That's really great. That's a lot of work.
How has working on Hauntings influenced your perspective on museums and their role in the community?
And going back to what I said about it being a unique way to, to learn about our local history, I think Loudoun Museum has been a good example of how you can work with the surrounding community, um, to bring folks in, both to the town and to the museum itself. It's a way that the museum can be a center of the community. I guess for, oh gosh, 10 or 15 years now, a lot of museums, especially smaller museums, have looked at how they can be a center of the community, how they can be sort of a mini town square, how they can be a safe place for people to come together. And I think programs like Hauntings is an example of that, ways to bring folks together in the community, have an evening of fun, have an evening of entertainment, but also have an evening of learning. And it benefits the participants, it benefits the museum, it benefits the businesses. And it puts a little museum like Loud Museum into the limelight a bit. So it's kind of a win-win situation, good for the community, good for the museum.
Is there anything else you'd like to share about the program or its significance?
Well, I'd certainly say, and this is probably more of a message for other small museums, is that you can dream big. Haunting seemed like a huge undertaking back in 1991 when we first took it on, but it took, 4 or 5 individuals who were committed to it, to make it happen. So it's whether it's a museum or another small organization in our broader Loudoun community, or for that matter, an individual. You can dream big. You can look at something like this size of activity of event, and you can pull it off. And it's gratifying to know that it's still popular. It's still bringing people in, and whether they like it or not, people are learning local history. There you go.
Hauntings is definitely what it is today because of you and your team. It is a highlight of my life being in Loudoun County and growing up here. I've heard so many wonderful things. I've got to experience it as, being in the tour, and then I've got to experience it as a volunteer. So the example that you set has just definitely been just continued and carried on. And I think all of us from Loudoun Museum just want to say thank you. We really appreciate all the work that you did and that you continue to do with Loudoun County. So
Well,
thank
thank
you.
you. Thanks, Sarah. It makes me feel good, and I'm excited that there are young people out there like you who are going to carry the torch beyond this. So thank you again for inviting me to share some memories of Hauntings with you and with the listeners who will tune into this. And I hope that Hauntings is a big success again this year for the museum.
Thank you, Tracy, for speaking with me today, and thank you all for joining us and listening to Loudoun Museum's inaugural podcast. We hope you enjoyed exploring these stories about the origins of Hauntings. We invite you to subscribe for more episodes, share your thoughts with us on social media, and even experience Hauntings. Tickets are available through our website. Until next time, keep listening and learning. See you at the museum.